The official designation for Sector 7G of the orbital station Concordia was the Zone of Inimical Floral Aggression. This was a title composed by a committee, which tells you everything you need to know about its dramatic flair and its complete lack of punch. Most residents just called it the Death Garden, which was shorter, catchier, and significantly more accurate. It was a place where evolution had gotten drunk, belligerent, and then spent the next 1,000 years holding a grudge against all forms of ambulatory life. The flora within didn't just passively poison you, it actively conspired against you. There were vines that set tripwires, flowers that mimicked the sound of crying babies to lure you into spitting range of their acidic nectar, and a species of moss that, if stepped on, would release spores that made you forget what you were doing until the moss had time to digest your boots. For 50 years, the Death Garden had been under a Class Omega quarantine. Entry was forbidden. Study was forbidden. Even thinking too hard about the sentient, knife-wielding grass was generally discouraged. The Grolian hegemony, who managed the station with the kind of rigid, humorless efficiency only a six-limbed insected bureaucracy can muster, had declared it a permanent loss. A monument to the folly of underestimating xenobotany. Which is why Zorp, a junior archivist whose gelatinous body was currently vibrating at a frequency that threatened to shatter the nearby plasteel window, was having a very, very bad day. You want to what? Zorp's primary ocular stalk quivered, focusing on the small, soft-skinned mammal sitting calmly across his desk. The mammal, a human named Arthur Pinter, took a delicate sip from a mug that read "Don't talk to me until I've pruned my existential dread." Arthur lowered the mug. "I want to file a homesteading claim," he repeated, enunciating with the patient air of someone explaining a very simple concept to a very distressed Jell-O mold. "For Sector 7G. Zorp saw the three eyes, which had been darting around the room looking for an escape route, snapped back to Arthur. The Death Garden? Is that what we're calling it? A bit melodramatic, isn't it?" Arthur mused. "I prefer the overgrown allotment with territorial tendencies, but yes, that's the one. But it's forbidden." Zorp fluted, his voice a series of high-pitched warbles. "It's a zone of inimical aggression. The flowers are classified as hostile combatants." "Yes, I've read the file," Arthur said, tapping a datapad on Zorp's desk. "Fascinating stuff. The laryngeal mimicry orchid is a particular stroke of genius. But you seem to have missed a rather crucial detail in the station's founding charter." He smiled a placid, unassuming smile that was, in its own way, more terrifying than any carnivorous plant. Section 4, subsection 12, paragraph C. Any territory within station jurisdiction, if left unclaimed and undeveloped for a period of no less than 20 standard years, may be claimed for private homesteading by any station resident in good standing. Zorp's entire form sagged. He knew the clause. It was an archaic remnant from the station's frontier days, intended for prospectors claiming rogue asteroids that drifted into the station's gravity well. No one had used it in over a century. No one had ever, in the history of sentient thought, considered using it on a quarantined death trap full of homicidal shrubbery. "That clause is for rocks," Zorp whispered. "Inert, non-aggressive, non-spore-releasing rocks. The language is quite clear," Arthur said cheerfully. "It specifies territory. Sector 7G is, undeniably, territory. It has been unclaimed and undeveloped, in the Grolian sense of not turned into a perfectly sterile, beige-colored storage facility, for 50 years. I am a resident in good standing. My rent is paid, I have no outstanding library fines, and I have never once misused the sonic showers. I believe my claim is legally unassailable." Zorp made a sound like a deflating balloon letting out its last, tragic gasp of air. He knew the human was right. The Grolian legal system was a monstrous, labyrinthine beast, but it was, above all else, literal. If a rule was written, the rule was absolute. There were no provisions for common sense. Common sense was an emotional, illogical concept, and therefore inefficient. "The High Proctor will have me rendered down for nutrient paste," Zorp moaned. "Nonsense," Arthur said, waving a dismissive hand. "You're just the archivist. You're a functionary. A cog in the great, glorious machine. They can't blame the cog for the ridiculousness of the machine's design. Now about that paperwork. The news of the homesteading claim did not travel so much as it detonated in the upper echelons of station command. It reached High Proctor Kthar in his sterile, hexagonal command chamber, where he was in the middle of a 17-hour meditative trance on the importance of proper filing procedures. The alert chimed, a polite but insistent violation of his sanctum. Kthar unfurled his 6 limbs with a series of sharp, irritated clicks of his chitinous exoskeleton. His mandibles twitched as he read the report on the holographic display. He read it once. Then a second time. Then he instructed the station's central computer to verify that it was not, in fact, April 1st on the human calendar, a day he had learned to dread with every fiber of his being. It is a joke, Kthar pronounced to the empty room. His voice was a dry, rasping baritone, like rocks grinding together. A soft-skin absurdity. A procedural error, the computer replied in its soothing, androgynous voice. The claim filed by human resident Arthur Pinter for Sector 7G is valid under Station Charter 1A, Section 4, Subsection 12, Paragraph C. All forms have been correctly submitted. Kthar's upper limbs clenched into fists. His lower limbs braced themselves against the polished floor. His middle limbs, the delicate ones used for manipulating data slates and occasionally strangling incompetent subordinates, trembled with sheer, unadulterated fury. Summon the human, he rasped. And summon Security Chief Grack. I wish to have a witness for the dressing down of a lifetime. And I may require someone to clean up the remains. This, you see, was the core of the problem. Kthar was a being of pure, unyielding order. He saw the universe as a grand, cosmic filing cabinet. Everything had a place, a label, and a clearly defined purpose. The Death Garden was an anomaly, a file that refused to fit in any drawer, so it had been locked away in a cabinet marked Never Open a Human, a species Kthar privately regarded as ambulatory chaos agents held together by hubris and calcium, had just picked the lock using one of Kthar's own rules. It was not just an administrative headache. It was a personal insult. It was a stain upon the very concept of order. Arthur Pinter arrived at the High Proctor's office precisely on time, holding a fresh mug of tea. This one red powered by caffeine and poor life choices. Accompanying him was Grack, the station's security chief. Grack was a chromag, a species that looked like a sentient granite boulder had decided to take up bodybuilding. His skin had the texture of rough-hewn stone, and his vocabulary was famously economical. Humph! Grack had grunted when ordered to escort the human, a sound that conveyed skepticism, mild annoyance, and the unspoken question of whether he should bring a body bag. Kthar was standing at his full height, an imposing posture meant to intimidate lesser beings. It didn't work on Grack, who was taller, and it certainly didn't work on Arthur, who was currently examining a decorative crystal on Kthar's desk with polite interest. Human Pinter, Kthar began, his voice dripping with condescension. You have filed a claim. An amusing claim. Glad you think so, Arthur said pleasantly. I was worried it might be seen as a bit forward. Would you care for some tea? It's a lovely Earl Grey. Very calming. He gestured with his mug. Kthar's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sure sign of agitation. I do not require calming, I require an explanation for this mockery of galactic law. It's not a mockery, Arthur corrected gently. It's a perfectly legitimate application of galactic law. A beautiful, if slightly dusty, piece of legal precedent. I found it tucked away between the regulations on standardized cargo container dimensions and the bylaws concerning the appropriate decibel level for recreational yodeling. Grack made a sound that could have been a cough or a chuckle. It was hard to tell with Cro-Mags. Kthar leaned forward, his multifaceted eyes boring into Arthur. You cannot possibly comprehend what you are asking for. Sector 7G is not a garden. It is a biological weapon system that happens to be rooted in soil. The Grolian hegemony's finest xenobiologists, beings with cognitive functions vastly superior to your own, I might add, declared it an unsolvable, cataclysmic threat. They weren't botanists, though, were they? Arthur asked, taking another sip of tea. They were xenobiologists. Different discipline entirely. They see a plant that shoots neurotoxin darts and they classify it as hostile flora, threat level. Magenta. A botanist sees it and says, a defense mechanism. Probably overproducing due to nutrient deficiency and a lack of natural predators. A bit stressed, poor dear. Kthar stared. He had never, in his 300 years of service, heard a creature described as a poor dear, after it had successfully dissolved a Class 5 armored drone. You believe you can, what? Tame it? Kthar hissed. Tame is such an aggressive word. I prefer encourage it to be its best self, create a more harmonious living arrangement. A bit of pruning, some soil aeration, maybe introduce a bit of companion planting. You'd be amazed what a well-placed marigold can do for morale. Marigolds? Kthar repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. You intend to fight a self-aware, predatory ecosystem with marigolds? Among other things, Arthur confirmed. And a good, sturdy pair of secateurs. You can't underestimate the importance of quality tools. There was a long, heavy silence in the room, broken only by the hum of the station's life support and the soft clink of Arthur's mug as he set it down. Kthar looked from the infuriatingly placid human to Grak, who simply shrugged his massive stone shoulders. The gesture was clear. The paperwork is valid. My hands are tied. Kthar felt a rage so pure and crystalline it was almost beautiful. He had spent his entire career building a fortress of regulations, a perfect, unbreachable edifice of order. And this soft, fleshy mammal had just found the one unlocked window, a window Kthar himself had failed to notice, and was now climbing inside to rearrange the furniture. Very well, human, Kthar rasped, the words tearing from his throat. The claim is provisionally approved. You may have your homestead, but be warned. He pointed a sharp, chitinous finger at Arthur. The moment one of your poor dears breaches quarantine, the moment a single aggressive pollen grain escapes, I will invoke Emergency Protocol 734 Gamma, which involves the immediate and total plasma venting of the entire sector. And you, Mr. Pinter, will be inside it. Arthur beamed. Excellent. I wouldn't have it any other way. A little bit of pressure really helps focus the mind. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some mulch to prepare. Chief Grak, it was a pleasure. He strode out of the office, leaving a stunned High Proctor and a deeply confused security chief in his wake. Sir? Grak rumbled after a moment. Orders? Kthar's mandibles worked silently for a few seconds before he finally managed to speak. Assign a security detail. Full biohazard gear. Their orders are to observe and document. I want a complete record of this human's spectacular, and hopefully brief, demise. And the human? He is not to be assisted, Kthar snarled. He made this ridiculous bed of carnivorous thorns. Let him lie in it. The entrance to Sector 7G was less a door and more a monument to fear. It was a Tripurian-forced, air-sealed blast door emblazoned with more warning symbols than a Grolian dictionary has words for caution. There were pictograms for death, dismemberment, dissolving, poisoning, strangulation, spontaneous combustion, and one particularly creative one that seemed to involve being turned inside out by a large, angry-looking flower. Arthur stood before it, dressed not in a state-of-the-art hazard suit, but in a pair of sturdy overalls, steel-toed boots, and a wide-brimmed sun hat. He carried a canvas-tote bag filled with what looked suspiciously like gardening tools. Grak stood beside him, clad in full environmental armor that could withstand hard vacuum and direct plasma fire. He felt, for the first time in his decorated career, profoundly overdressed. The observation team is in position. Grak grunted, his voice tinny over the armor's external speaker. They are in a shielded gallery overlooking the sector. They will not interfere. Splendid, Arthur said, adjusting his hat. Always nice to have an audience. Keeps you on your toes. He placed his palm on the access panel. The station's computer, which had been programmed with a healthy dose of self-preservation, spoke in a tone of polite horror. Access to Sector 7G is restricted. This zone is classified as an Omega-level biohazard. Do you wish to confirm your terminal death wish? Yes, please, Arthur said cheerfully. Authorization Pinter Arthur, homesteading Claim 7G Alpha. There was a pause, as if the computer was consulting its therapist. Then, with a sigh of resigned hydraulics, the first blast door began to grind open. Then the second. Then the third. A wave of air washed over them, thick and cloying and smelling of damp soil, sweet decay, and something that smelled unnervingly like ozone and malice. Grak's armor sensors immediately went wild. Warning! Airborne neurotoxins detected. Mild hallucinogens. Corrosive particulates at 300 parts per million inch. Ah, that'll be the Gigglebloom pollen, Arthur said, sniffing the air appreciatively. And the exhaust from the petulant pitcher plant, it gets cranky when it hasn't been fed. Don't worry, it's all very low level out here by the entrance. He took a step inside. Grak, bound by his orders, took a hesitant step after him. The final door hissed shut behind them, sealing them in. The sight that greeted them was a mess. It was a jungle, but a jungle designed by a committee of sadists. The air was thick with a greenish mist. Twisted, dark green vines, thick as a man's arm, snaked across the floor, twitching periodically. Strange, brightly colored flowers pulsed with a faint, internal light. In the distance, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard rose and fell in a rhythmic, unsettling cadence. That would be the screaming orchids. Grak activated his suit's full-spectrum scanner. Red threat indicators bloomed across his heads-up display like a rash. Everything was a threat. The floor, the walls, the air itself. According to his tactical overlay, the safest place in the entire biodome was approximately 2 inches behind his own eyeballs. Human! Grak rumbled, his hand instinctively going to the plasma rifle magnetically clamped to his thigh. Threat assessment is total. Every plant form is exhibiting aggressive postures. Arthur, however, wasn't looking at the threat indicators. He was looking at the soil. He knelt down, ignoring the twitching vine just inches from his boot, and scooped up a handful of dark earth. He crumbled it between his fingers, sniffed it, and even touched a tiny speck to his tongue, a move that made Grak's internal suit monitor flatline for a solid second. Arthur said, wiping his hands on his overalls. Acidic. Very acidic. And compacted. No wonder everyone's so irritable. They can't breathe. He stood up, pulled a large, 3-pronged cultivator from his tote bag, and walked over to the nearest pulsating, vaguely threatening shrub. The shrub, a sudden impalement bush according to the Grolian database, had long, sharp thorns that could track movement. Several of them were currently aimed directly at Arthur's face. Now, Arthur said to the bush, in the same tone one might use with a nervous cat. There's no need for that. I'm not going to hurt you. He began to work the soil around the base of the bush with his cultivator. The thorns twitched, following his every move. Grak tensed, ready to vaporize the plant at a moment's notice. But Arthur was slow, methodical, and calm. He hummed a little off-key tune as he broke up the compacted earth. He pulled out a few smaller, weed-like growths that were crowding the bush's roots. The thorns, which had been vibrating with aggressive intent, slowly lowered. The faint, angry red glow at their base faded to a neutral blue. See? Arthur said, patting the soil. Much better, isn't it? A little room to stretch your roots. He then pulled a small watering can from his bag. A watering can, Grak noted with dawning horror, that he had apparently brought with him from his quarters, and gave the bush a gentle drink. The water wasn't just water, though. It had a faint, pungent smell. A bit of liquid kelp and fish emulsion, Arthur explained to Grak, who hadn't asked. They're heavy feeders, these ones. All that thorn growing takes a lot of energy. He moved on to the next plant, an ambuscade vine that had laid a perfect, almost invisible tripwire across the main path. Instead of cutting it, Arthur carefully rerouted it, guiding it up a nearby rock face. You're a climber, he told the vine. You don't want to be groveling on the floor. It's undignified. Here, let's give you something to aspire to. Grack watched, his massive, stony jaw metaphorically on the floor. He had seen footage. He knew that Vine had once tripped a maintenance drone, which then fell into a patch of rapid digestive fungi and was reduced to its component atoms in under a minute. And this human was coiling it. Like a garden hose. From the shielded observatory, High Proctor Cthar was watching the same scene on a high-resolution monitor. His mandibles were clicking so fast they sounded like a faulty engine. "What is he doing?" Cthar demanded of the terrified-looking technician next to him. "He appears to be gardening, High Proctor," the technician squeaked. "That is not gardening. That is consorting with the enemy. The vine should have constricted him. The bush should have perforated him. Why is nothing trying to kill him?" On the screen, Arthur had moved on to the screaming orchids. He'd pulled out a small, portable audio player and had placed it on a rock. The gentle, complex strains of a Bach cello suite began to fill the air. The screeching, which had been a constant, nerve-shredding noise, faltered. It became discordant, then quiet. A few of the orchids tentatively tried to mimic the notes of the cello, producing a sound that was less a scream and more a confused, mournful wail. "There we go," Arthur murmured. "Better than screaming your heads off all day, isn't it? Very stressful on the old larynx." Grack, meanwhile, had lowered his plasma rifle. His tactical display was still a Christmas tree of red alerts, but his own senses were telling him a different story. The air felt calmer. The constant, predatory tension that had saturated the biodome was starting to ease. It was still a place where you could die in 100 inventive ways, but it no longer felt like the garden was actively willing you to. "Human," Grack said, his voice laced with a new emotion, utter bewilderment. "What are you doing?" Arthur looked up from gently misting a fern that, according to the database, fired its razor-sharp fronds at sudden movements. "I'm gardening," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. "These plants aren't evil. They're just stressed. It's a classic case of a hostile work environment. Poor management, no clear growth path, and a complete lack of positive reinforcement." He gestured around the biodome. "Look at this place. No biodiversity. No symbiotic relationships. Everything is in competition with everything else. The Grolians just threw them all in here and expected them to behave. It's the botanical equivalent of putting 100 hungry predators in a locked room with a single piece of meat. Of course they're going to be aggressive." He went back to his tote bag and pulled out another, smaller bag. It was filled with seeds. "My secret weapon," he said with a wink. "Ladybugs." Grack just stared. His programming, his training, his entire cultural worldview had no file for this. He was a warrior, a guardian. He solved problems with overwhelming force. Arthur Pinter, it seemed, solved problems with mulch, classical music, and beneficial insects. And the terrifying part, the part that made Grack's granite-like skin crawl, was that it appeared to be working. The days that followed settled into a bizarre routine. Every morning, Arthur would enter the death garden, and Grack, his designated chaperone and potential first responder, would follow. The observation gallery remained perpetually staffed by Cthar's increasingly confused and bored agents. Arthur's work was slow and deliberate. He didn't try to conquer the garden, he tried to understand it. He learned that the procrastination pollen, released by a plant he dubbed the deadline lily, was a defensive measure triggered by rapid approach. If you walked towards it slowly, humming softly, it would remain dormant. He learned that the sentient fungus that communicated through complex, shifting patterns of bioluminescence was not, as the Grolians believed, issuing threats. It was complaining about the draft. Arthur, in response, built a small rock wall that blocked the airflow from a nearby vent, and the fungus's light pattern shifted to a calm, appreciative azure. He even started leaving it small offerings of a specialized fertilizer blend, a gesture it acknowledged with a brief, flashing pattern that Arthur was pretty sure meant thanks. Grack, for his part, had transitioned from bodyguard to bemused apprentice. He found himself, to his own astonishment, helping. It started small. Arthur would ask him to lift a heavy rock, and Grack would oblige. Then Arthur taught him how to identify and pull the invasive chokeweed, a parasitic plant that was the root cause of much of the garden's nutrient imbalance. Grack, a being who could punch through a starship's hull, found a strange satisfaction in the simple, tactile act of ripping the life-draining weeds out of the soil. Good, Grack would grunt, holding up a particularly nasty specimen. Excellent work, Grack, Arthur would reply. See the taproot on that one? Very persistent. You've got a real knack for this. Grack felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his stony chest. It might have been pride. Or it might have been a low-grade fungal infection. With this place, you could never be sure. Meanwhile, High Proctor Cthar was not having a good time. His daily reports on operation and pending doom were becoming a source of intense personal frustration. Day 5. Human Pinter has introduced a species of predatory mite to combat the flesh-eating aphids. Casualties, 0 humans, approximately 4 billion aphids. Day 9. Human Pinter has repurposed the ambuscade vine. It no longer functions as a tripwire. He has trained it to grow along a trellis system, forming what he calls a delightful, shady pergola. Day 14. The screaming orchids have stopped screaming. Pinter has taught them to harmonize. They now perform a passable, if slightly unsettling, 3-part harmony rendition of Greensleeves every afternoon at 1500 hours. Cthar would read these reports and his mandibles would grind with such force that fine chitinous dust would sprinkle onto his pristine desk. This was an outrage. A farce. The human wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. He was turning a bioweapon into a tourist attraction. The final straw came on day 21. The station's PA system, usually reserved for docking announcements and emergency alerts, crackled to life. A reminder to all station personnel, the calm computer voice announced. The zone of inimical floral aggression, now tentatively renamed Arthur's Contemplative Arboretum, will be holding its first public concert this evening. The Screaming Orchids will be performing a selection of Terran classical pieces. Please maintain a respectful silence. They are sensitive artists, Cthar snapped. He slammed his fist on his console, cracking the surface. The human wasn't just homesteading, he was engaging in cultural programming. He was gentrifying the Death Garden. No more, Cthar hissed to himself. The rules have failed me. It is time to find new rules. He dove into the Grolian Administrative Code, a document so vast and convoluted that it was rumored to have its own gravity. He searched for hours, his 6 limbs flying across holographic displays, digging through clauses and subclauses and appendices to appendices. He ignored requisitions, bypassed maintenance schedules, and delayed 17 separate trade agreements. And then, in the deep, dark archives of civic planning, he found it. It was a beautiful, elegant, and utterly vicious piece of bureaucratic weaponry, the Interspecies Horticultural Exhibition and Safety Mandate. The mandate was designed by Grolian landscape architects, a profession known for its extreme pedantry and a belief that the only good plant is a plant that grows in a perfectly straight line. It stated that any privately held botanical space larger than 10 cubic meters must be subject to a rigorous inspection to ensure it meets hegemony standards of aesthetic harmony and absolute predictability. The inspection was notoriously impossible to pass. It judged gardens on criteria like symmetrical foliage distribution, uniform coloration, and most damningly, the complete and total absence of spontaneous, unprogrammed activity. Failure to pass the inspection resulted in the immediate, non-negotiable sanitization of the offending area. Sanitization, in Grolian terms, meant plasma fire. Cthar leaned back in his chair, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his insected features. Arthur Pinter might be able to sweet-talk a homicidal shrub, but he couldn't argue with a 3,000-page inspection manual. The human had used the rules to claim his garden. Now Cthar would use the rules to take it away. He sent the official notification immediately. It arrived on Arthur's datapad as he and Grack were enjoying a cup of tea under the newly formed pergola of the now docile ambuscade vine. Grack read the summons over Arthur's shoulder. His brow ridges furrowed. "This is bad," he rumbled. Grolian inspectors are precise. Precise was the Cro-Mag word for soul-crushing sticklers for detail. Arthur finished his tea before responding. He read through the notification, a faint smile playing on his lips. He then downloaded the full inspection manual. All 3,000 pages of it. An inspection, he said thoughtfully. They want the garden to be safe, predictable, and aesthetically pleasing according to Grolian standards. It is impossible, Grack stated flatly. This garden is wild. The inspectors will fail it on the first glance. Perhaps, Arthur said, scrolling through the dense text. Or perhaps, they've just given us the instruction manual. He looked around the garden. The plants, while no longer actively trying to murder them, were still a chaotic riot of life. The sudden impalement bush still had its thorns. The petulant pitcher plant still spat acid, albeit into a designated trough Arthur had built for it. The deadline lily still held its pollen in reserve. They were manageable, not domesticated. Grolian aesthetics, Arthur mused, tapping his chin. Symmetry. Order. Repetition. And their idea of safety is predictability. They don't mind if something is dangerous, as long as it's dangerous on a predictable schedule. A slow, audacious, and frankly ridiculous plan began to form in his mind. Grack, he said, turning to the stone giant. How are you with topiary? Grack blinked. Topiary? Creative hedge trimming, Arthur clarified. I'm going to need your help. We have 1 week until the inspection. We're going to have to teach the entire garden a new routine. The week that followed was one of the most surreal in the station's history. The observers in the gallery watched, utterly baffled, as Arthur and Grack began what could only be described as a botanical boot camp. Arthur, armed with the inspection manual and a pair of pruning shears, became a director. Grack, with his immense strength and surprising dexterity, became his stagehand. They started with the sudden impalement bush. Arthur, referencing a diagram in the manual for acceptable shrubbery forms, directed Grack to trim the bush into a perfect sphere. The bush, surprisingly, seemed to enjoy the attention, its thorns retracting whenever Grack's heavy-duty shears came near. See? It's like a haircut, Arthur explained. Stimulates new growth. Next was the petulant pitcher plant. Its main issue was its unpredictable acid spitting. Arthur solved this by setting a timer. He discovered the plant's spitting reflex was tied to a specific light frequency. So he rigged a small lamp to flash at it every hour, on the hour. The plant would then obligingly spit its corrosive fluid into the ceramic trough. It was still a death trap, but now it was a punctual death trap. Predictable. The ambuscade vine, already enjoying its new life as a pergola, was easy. Arthur and Grack simply guided its growth, weaving it into an intricate, symmetrical lattice that was both beautiful and, according to the manual's section on structural flora, perfectly compliant. The biggest challenge was the deadline lily and its procrastination pollen. The inspectors would surely fail it for releasing a cloud of mind-altering spores. Arthur couldn't stop the pollen production, but he could control its release. He discovered the release was triggered by the carbon dioxide in exhaled breath. So, he built a small, automated device that would puff a tiny jet of CO2 at the lily from 20 feet away, causing it to release its pollen in a harmless, contained direction, far from the main path. He timed it for 13 minutes past the hour, every hour. Why 13? No reason. He just thought it was a funny number. The screaming orchids were already halfway there. Arthur just had to refine their performance. He spent 2 days working with them, using his audio player to teach them a new song, a Grolian ceremonial dirge. It was monotonous, deeply boring, and perfectly symmetrical in its composition. The orchids, ever the eager mimics, learned it flawlessly. By the end of the week, the Death Garden was transformed. It was still recognizably itself, but it was a version that had been through finishing school. The raw, chaotic danger had been replaced by a weird, highly choreographed performance of civility. It was less a death trap and more a piece of very eccentric, very dangerous dinner theater. It is strange, Grack admitted, looking at their handiwork. A row of what were once ankle-biter snap ferns now bent and straightened in unison, like a line of chorus dancers. "It's compliant," Arthur said, dusting off his hands. "And that's all that matters." The day of the inspection arrived. High Proctor Cthar did not attend in person, that would be beneath him, but he watched from his command chamber, a smug sense of impending victory warming his cold, black heart. He had dispatched Grand Adjudicator Vex, the most feared inspector in the hegemony. Vex was a Grolian whose chitin was a severe, matte black, and whose supplementary limbs were permanently crossed in a gesture of stern disapproval. He was said to have once failed a nebula for asymmetrical gas distribution. Vex and his two assistants, clipboards at the ready, strode into the garden. They were encased in silver-plated hazard suits, their faces grim. Grack and Arthur stood at the entrance to greet them. "Welcome to the Arboretum," Arthur said with a welcoming smile. Vex ignored him, his gaze sweeping across the scene. His mandibles twitched. This wasn't the chaotic hellscape he'd been anticipating. It was tidy. He saw the perfectly spherical impalement bush and made a note. Form: conforms to Standard 34B. Threat level: quiescent. He scowled. They proceeded down the path. Exactly on the hour, the petulant pitcher plant spat a glob of acid neatly into its trough. One of Vex's assistants tested it with a probe, which promptly dissolved. "Weaponized fluid discharge is on a predictable 60-minute cycle," the assistant reported. "Compliant with Regulation 218 concerning scheduled hazards." Vex's scowl deepened. They walked under the ambuscade vine pergola. Vex ran a gloved hand along the latticework. "Symmetry is adequate," he conceded, the word tasting like poison. As they passed the deadline lily, 13 minutes past the hour, they heard a faint puff from the undergrowth. A small, shimmering cloud of pollen drifted harmlessly into a ventilation duct on the far side of the biodome. Vex stopped, sniffing the air. His suit's sensors remained silent. "Report," he snapped. "No airborne contaminants detected on the designated walkway, Grand Adjudicator," his other assistant confirmed. By now, Vex was practically vibrating with frustration. Everything was wrong by being right. This garden was mocking him with its compliance. His final hope lay in the spontaneous aggression metric. This was the test that failed every garden. It involved placing a life-sized, sensor-laden test dummy in the center of the garden and waiting for something, anything, to attack it without provocation. The assistants set up the dummy. It was a standard Grolian model, vaguely insectoid and utterly featureless. They retreated to a safe distance. Vex, Arthur, and Grack stood by, watching. They waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The screaming orchids began their dirge, their monotonous, harmonized tones filling the air. The ankle-biter snapferns did their little synchronized bow. A full 5 minutes passed. The dummy remained untouched. The garden was a perfect picture of serene, predictable, and frankly boring safety. Vex had lost. The human had won. The thought was so intolerable, so fundamentally offensive to his sense of order, that he couldn't accept it. "Unacceptable!" he shrieked, the sound echoing in the humid air. He marched forward, his metallic boots clanking on the path. "The test is flawed. The specimen is clearly defective." He reached the dummy and, in a fit of pique, kicked it hard in its synthetic leg. And that's when it happened. It wasn't a big thing. It wasn't a lethal thing. But it was a beautiful thing. The ambuscade vine, which had been trained by Arthur for a week on a very specific trigger, shot out a single, thin tendril. Not from the pergola above, but from a root that had been carefully cultivated near the path. The trigger wasn't the kick. Arthur was more clever than that. The trigger was a sonic frequency analysis of the Grolian phrase for unacceptable. The tendril whipped around Vex's ankle with lightning speed. It didn't constrict. It didn't crush. It just pulled. Grand Adjudicator Vex, the most feared inspector in the Grolian hegemony, let out a surprised squawk as his feet were swept out from under him. He flailed wildly, his supplementary arms windmilling, before landing with a soft, undignified thump in a carefully prepared flower bed next to the path. The flower bed was filled with a species Arthur had cultivated from a minor, overlooked spore. He called it mildly inconvenient itching moss. It was non-toxic, non-lethal, and its effects lasted for exactly 1 hour. Vex scrambled to his feet, his silver suit now smeared with black soil. He began to scratch. First at his neck joint. Then under his primary arms. Then, with increasing desperation, at his posterior plating. "What is this?" he yelped, his dignity evaporating in a cloud of frantic scratching. Arthur consulted his datapad. According to the manual, Section 904, Paragraph F, a response to direct, physical provocation of a test subject is not considered spontaneous aggression, and since the resulting effect is non-lethal and temporary, it's classified as a benign environmental interaction. He looked up and gave Vex a beatific smile. "Congratulations, Grand Adjudicator. The Arboretum passes." High Proctor Kthar watched the final moments of the inspection on his monitor, his face a blank mask of chitin. He saw his most formidable agent reduced to a scratching, flailing mess. He saw the human, Arthur Pinter, standing there with a look of serene accomplishment. He saw Grack, the stoic warrior, let out a low rumble that sounded suspiciously like a deep, heartfelt laugh. He had lost. He had used the full might of the Grolian bureaucratic machine, and a soft-skinned mammal with a watering can and a penchant for loopholes had defeated it. He had not broken a single rule. He had simply followed them more creatively than anyone had ever imagined possible. Kthar did something he hadn't done in a century. He conceded defeat. He quietly typed a single command into his console: grant full, permanent title for Sector 7G to resident Arthur Pinter. Reclassify zone as public arboretum, Class A. Then he stood up, walked to his personal meditation chamber, and did not come out for 3 days. The news spread through the station like wildfire. The Death Garden was dead. Long live Arthur's contemplative arboretum. It became the single most popular attraction on the station. Tourists flocked to see the punctual pitcher plant, to walk under the pergola of the friendly ambuscade vine, and to listen to the screaming orchids perform their daily concerts. They were now taking requests. Their rendition of a Klingon opera was particularly moving. Grack, at his own request, was reassigned. He became the head of security and chief horticultural assistant for the Arboretum. He found he had a talent for bonsai, and spent his off hours carefully shaping miniature, and only slightly aggressive, versions of the sudden impalement bush. Zorp, the gelatinous archivist, received a commendation for his flawless handling of the unprecedented homesteading claim. He was promoted to senior records keeper and was lauded for his unflinching adherence to procedure in the face of administrative chaos. He spent most of his time quivering in his new, larger office, terrified that someone would try to homestead the reactor core next. And Arthur? Arthur was exactly where you'd expect him to be. He sat at a small wrought iron table he'd set up in the heart of his garden, a new mug in his hands. This one read, "I like my plants like I like my people, mostly quiet and with minimal spitting." He was having tea. Across from him, the sentient fungus he'd befriended pulsed with a calm, happy blue. Arthur had learned to read its more complex patterns. He'd even developed a rudimentary call-and-response system using a small, filtered flashlight. "More tea?" Arthur asked, holding up the pot. The fungus shimmered. A complex pattern of lights flashed across its surface, a swirling, intricate dance of bioluminescence that, if one knew how to read it, translated roughly to, "No thank you, Arthur. I'm quite content. But I do appreciate the offer. The soil pH is simply perfect today." Arthur smiled, poured himself another cup, and leaned back in his chair. The air was warm, the light was dappled, and the faint, harmonious sound of a Grolian dirge echoed gently through the leaves. It was, he decided, a lovely day in the garden. He had taken the most dangerous, feared place on the station and turned it into a sanctuary, not through force, but through understanding, a bit of elbow grease, and the profound, unshakable belief that there's no problem on Earth, or off it, that can't be solved with a good cup of tea and a careful reading of the fine print. And maybe, just maybe, a well-timed patch of mildly inconvenient itching moss. It was all a matter of applying the right tool for the job.